Hello and good afternoon, scholars. Welcome back to Mr. Sniffin's geometry class. Today we're going to be talking about early notation in our class or in our subject matter. Mathematicians consistently use symbols to dictate or infer upon the reader what they're talking about. We use symbols to express consistency, and that's kind of what we've been getting at the last couple weeks. When mathematicians want to express something, they have very fundamental linear ways in which they do it. Certainly abstract mathematicians exist and we have really complicated syllables and equations that we can use, but in geometry, and particularly in what we're studying, we have very basic symbols that we use to kind of express very fundamental rules or principles within our field of study. Today we're going to be talking about essentially what's called geometric notation. So let's take a look at our notes and see how we're going to organize and kind of understand some of these fundamental concepts. What I'd like for you to do first off is on your paper, as always, we're labeling our title Geometric Notation. Today should be July 21st, and we're going to have about 1 page. As long as we write small, 2 pages is perfectly fine though. First thing that we're going to do here is dictate what this concept of notation is. And it's basically just how we consistently name symbols, shapes, figures, and solids. What I'd like for you to do on your page is to set it up as 3 different columns. We're going to draw out some different figures, raise lines, things like that. We're going to write down the actual name of it, how we would just write it on a piece of paper, like saying point and P-O-I-N-T. And then notation would be the actual symbol that we would use, or how we would see it like on a piece of paper on a diagram or something along those lines. In the end, we should have a paper that's going to look a little bit something like this. All right, so let's go through. First thing that we're going to start off with is n, which is our 0-dimensional figure. Typically with a point, we're just going to see some type of large black dot and a capital N listed next to it. Just for your notes, for you to kind of pick up on, when I'm using capitals, it's going to be very specific, and when I use lowercase letters, it's going to be very specific as well too, and I'll try to show you some differences there. So just in terms of our name, we're talking about point N. Point does not need to be capital. It's not a proper noun, so you can just in the middle of a sentence like that is lowercase p point N. But for our notation, we're going to have capital N. Next up, what we're going to see here is we're going to start to use our compass, straight edge, whatever you got. Another thing that you can use is also like if you have 2 pencils, you can use one pencil to use as like a straight edge and the other obviously to trace your line. Here we have an endpoint and an arrow pointing off to the right, and that's going to be indicative of a ray. For this particular one, we're going to label it OF, and our ray is going to have 2 letters in its name. It's going to be ray OF specifically. Cool thing also, just so you know, we can flip the name. We can also call it ray FO if we want. And in terms of our notation for our syllable, as we see with a ray, it only points one direction, or it has one arrow on it, and that's just going to be in our symbol. We don't need a point on the end. And in addition to that, we could also point the arrow to the left-hand side if we want, and leave it as almost like this half-pointed arrow. But either one works. 99 times out of 100, you're going to see it printed with the arrow to the right. That's typically how you're going to type it in on a computer if you're using some type of coding software, like MATLAB or some type of latex coding. Next, what we're going to do here is look at a line. Lines have arrows on both ends. We can use either type of symbol that we want to for either of these. We're going to have 2 points and we're going to have capital L, capital U. We can say that this is line L, U. And in terms of our symbol, what we're looking at here, we can rearrange L and U in terms of the sequence, but what's most important is our syllable or symbol for our notation is going to have those arrow tips on the end. Next up we're looking at here is going to be our segment. As we said yesterday, in terms of our definition, our segment's going to have two endpoints, and the most direct connection is essentially a straight line. We're going to call this one just segment XS. And segment XS, in terms of our notation, no endpoints, no arrows, just a little tiny, essentially a segment drawn right on top of it. But there's many ways that we can express kind of these symbols that are here. The next one we're going to do is a line again, but it's going to be drawn a little bit differently. What you'll see here is a lowercase letter, for instance, lowercase g. Typically, you'll see in your diagrams a lowercase l. But you'll notice, in terms of our notation, you'll just see a lowercase letter. And as we go through here, so far you've seen like pretty much everything's been uppercase. That lowercase letter is going to be kind of indicative to tell us that we're looking at a line. Come here, kitty. All right. So, our next symbol that we're going to be looking at, we're going to start to look at angles. So now we've pretty much identified all of our lines, rays, segments in terms of how we're going to notate them. Now we're going to expand on that. We're actually going to go into our angles. The first one that we're going to draw here is just we're going to talk about what's a vertex. And a vertex we can kind of loosely describe in terms of a definition is that point that exists in an angle. It's where two segments, two rays, two lines intersect. In this particular example, we're just going to call this vertex B, and oftentimes how it's written down would just be angle B. And this symbol right here is what we're going to be using in this angle situation. So this is one way that you'll commonly see things referred to. The only problem is with angles is sometimes you have a whole bunch of lines and rays intersecting. So I'll show you how you kind of differentiate this here. We're going to draw another example here. And just so you know, with angles, vertexes, you can do lines, rays, and segments form that numeric value in the corner. So we can draw arrows if we want. We can also just end it as a ray or a segment, whatever you'd like. But this one, we're going to have letters M, N, and Q. But the way that we would go about expressing this, we can call this either angle M, just like our vertex B. We're naming that middle point, or what's very helpful, especially if we have multiple lines and segments crossing one another, is going to be angle NMQ, and our vertex always goes in the middle. And that's kind of what your focus is going to be today when you do your practice after this, is working with the naming status. Kind of just like our vertex, we're going to put NMQ. And the underline is just for your emphasis, but we're going to put the vertex in the middle. Alright, just a couple more before we finish up here. Slide up our page. Next, we're going to look at some symbols I've shown you already, but I want to make sure that we kind of have them just stored in our notes. First one that we're going to look at here is I'm going to draw a parallelogram. Parallelogram is any shape which is a quadrilateral, and its opposite sides are congruent, and its opposite sides are parallel, and we'll talk a little bit about more this week. But here, what we can go ahead and say is this bottom is parallel, or it's kind of at the same angle. And we're using those arrows to kind of dictate that. In this particular example, we can say that segment TR is parallel to segment OI, and if we wanted to just write this out on our piece of paper, the symbol we use to show whether or not something is parallel is these almost like L's to represent basically two parallel lines. So we have segment TR is parallel to OI. Because of those arrows, we can see that written out there. And the last thing where I'm just going to show you here along the bottom of the page is going to be congruency within these types of symbols. So you can pick any letters you want here to label this kind of rectangle that we got here. This little square. I'm going to call it M-U-R-S, MERS. Good musician. So we're going to say here, and what congruency means is basically we're talking about the same size and same shape. It's a little bit different than using what we would describe as being equal. If we're using numeric representation, referring to as kind of like if something is, or two objects, two pipes, say, are 10 feet long, we would say those two 10-feet pipes are equal to each other. But if we're talking about not just the numerical size, but we're just more so saying like, oh, those two basketballs are congruent to one another. We never really quantified precisely what value we're talking about. We're more so talking about the shape, the size, the way they look, these kind of physical characteristics that are more than just measurements, say, if you will. So that's going to be it in terms of our notations for today. Just remember while you're working on your practice questions, your vertex is going in the center when we're talking about angles. Whenever we're looking at syllables, symbols, things like that, we want to make sure that we're using proper notation. So when we're giving directions, which is essentially what formulas are, or proofs, statements, things like that, the person reading it knows exactly what to do. So just imagine in a hypothetical, if you're writing out blueprints or anything like that, you're giving like directions for your friends to cook something and you're just kind of choosing different arbitrary symbols, it's obviously going to be much harder to follow directions and you have real world consequences to it. Until next time, please stop by office hours, come hang out and talk. If you have any questions, always feel free to message me. Stay safe and have a nice day. Bye.